Welcome to Political Science 201. This is Introduction to American Government. My name is Laura Fleming. I'm an instructor at Louisiana Tech, and this is the first lecture in our online series. I'd like you to think about a question, pretty basic. Why do we have government? Most people would agree that society just does not do very well if we don't have rules and if we don't have someone to enforce those rules. We tend to degenerate into chaos, Lord of the Flies type environment. So basically we need law and order, and we need some form of government to enforce law and order. Now we may disagree about what rules are appropriate, and especially about who needs to make the rules, but I think we can all agree that we do need some form of government, some form of laws and enforcement to keep people from injuring each other. Today, we're going to talk about the origin of our American government, the creation of the U.S. Constitution. So just a brief overview here. We're going to talk about John Locke. He was an Enlightenment philosopher. He had some ideas on government that were very influential on our founders. We'll discuss that. We'll discuss America's two core values as detailed in our Declaration of Independence, the values of freedom and equality. We'll also talk about the Articles of Confederation. That's the very first attempt at an American government. Was not very successful. So we'll talk about why the Articles were not successful and why ultimately we needed a new Constitution, which was drafted up at this Constitutional Convention. So this is the overview for our first lecture here. Okay, so philosophers from the Age of Enlightenment heavily influenced the American founders. So the founders were a product of their times. Their times were the late 1700s, and that was the tail end of this movement in Western Europe. It was called the Enlightenment. It lasted from the late 1600s to the late 1700s, and it was promoted by these kinds of coffee house philosophers. Some people speculate that as caffeinated beverages became more popular in Western Europe, that people started waking up to the powers of the mind and the powers of reasoning and logic. So Enlightenment philosophers emphasized human reason over the simple acceptance of tradition. So they were all about challenging tradition. They challenged traditional institutions like the Catholic Church. They challenged traditional forms of government and society. They emphasized skepticism, science, asking questions, tolerating different viewpoints, etc. So John Locke in particular, he was a British doctor and an Enlightenment philosopher, and the reason he's important to us today is because he used his mind, his powers of logic to think about government, and he was heavily influential on the founder. So Dr. Locke performed a thought experiment about where government comes from. One of the problems with government is it's not really susceptible to the scientific method, right? So they're too big to put in a laboratory and analyze, and even if you could experiment on governments, it could have pretty disastrous results for a lot of people. So that's not really possible, at least not for Dr. Locke. So what he did is he performed a thought experiment. Okay, so he's just thinking about things, and he starts with this hypothetical state of nature. Okay, state of nature is a imaginary place very early in human development. So you can imagine Adam and Eve coming out of the Garden of Eden, or the first cave people coming out of the caves. And Dr. Locke asked the question, how did they get from that kind of naive state into a situation where we have government. Now, when I think of the state of nature, I think about Alaska. This is a picture that I took, a very beautiful mountain and valley scene in Alaska. So my husband had a thing for these Alaskan reality TV shows he used to watch all the time. Alaska, The Last Frontier. There was Building Off the Grid in Alaska. There was even one called Alaskan Bush People. And the idea behind these shows is that you can go to Alaska and basically be in a state of nature. You can do whatever you want. You can have all kinds of building projects, and it's just a great, wild, free place to live. But I told my husband, I said, you know, I just don't think they're showing you the whole picture there. I mean, 8 or 9 months of the year when Alaska is all snow and ice probably don't make for very good reality TV. But my husband, he wanted to move to Alaska, right? So I compromised with him. I said, okay, we'll take a cruise. So our anniversary was coming up. We took this cruise to Alaska, and that's where I took the picture on the slide. And you see this picture, very inspiring. It makes you want to go out and frolic in the state of nature, right? Just enjoy the freedom. But then the cruise ship took a turn. We started going down this little narrow channel, and it started to get a little colder and a little darker, and there were little flurries in the air, and the scenery changed, and we were looking at something like this. This is a picture of a glacier. Also very beautiful. The colors were very vibrant. I wasn't expecting that. I'd never seen a glacier before. But all of a sudden, you're not thinking about how much you want to go and frolic in the state of nature anymore. You're thinking thoughts like, wow, you know, it's kind of cold, and maybe I've seen enough, and maybe it's time to go back into the cruise ship and hit the buffet line, right? So, you know, there's a harsh side to the state of nature, even in Alaska. So Dr. Locke was a smart guy. He knew this. And there's good news and bad news about Locke's state of nature. So let's talk about this a little bit. I am pulling out the original text by John Locke called Two Treatises of Government. And so I think it's important to read from the original material. So I'm going to read to you guys a little bit from Dr. Locke, some of his ideas about government. Here we go. He's talking about the state of nature. And he says, to understand political power right and derive it from its original, we must consider what state all men are naturally in. And that is a state of perfect freedom to order their actions and dispose of their possessions and persons as they think fit within the bounds of the law of nature. So he says, in the state of nature, people are free. Locke goes on, he says, this state of nature is also a state of equality, wherein all the power and jurisdiction is reciprocal, no one having more than another. There being nothing more evident than that creatures of the same species and rank, born to all the same advantages of nature and the use of the same faculties, should also be equal one amongst another without subordination or subjection. So he says, in the state of nature, essentially, people are free and equal. Sounds pretty good. Not only that, he walks it back a little bit. He says, you're not 100% free to do whatever you want. He says, though this be a state of liberty, it is not a state of license. So he says, you can't do everything that you want to do. The state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, which obliges everyone And reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind who will but consult it, that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. So basically he says the state of nature has a natural law which says do no harm. And Locke goes on, he explains why we have this law, men being all the workmanship of one omnipotent and infinitely wise maker, all the servants of one sovereign master. So he's basically saying we're all God's children. Everyone may not take away or impair the life, liberty, health, limb, or goods of another. So that's the law of nature, do no harm. Okay, so moving on, question comes up, who enforces natural law in the state of nature? I mean, if everybody's free and equal and nobody's above anybody else, then who gets to enforce natural law? And Locke has an answer for that. He says, the execution of the law of nature is in that state put into every man's hands, whereby everyone has a right to punish the transgressors of that law to such a degree as may hinder its violation. For the law of nature would, as all other laws that concern men in this world, be in vain if there were nobody in the state of nature that had a power to execute that law, preserve the innocent, and restrain offenders. So basically he says, you're right, somebody has to enforce natural law in the state of nature. That's everyone. Every man hath a right to punish the offender and be executioner of the law of nature. Anybody see a problem with that? Any problem about everyone enforcing the law of nature? Locke actually sees a problem. He says, it's unreasonable for men to be judges in their own cases. People are biased. Self-love will make men partial to themselves and their friends. So if somebody harms you, you're going to be all about enforcing the law of nature on that person. Locke says, on the other side, ill nature, passion, and revenge will carry them too far in punishing others, and hence nothing but confusion and disorder will follow. So that's the problem with self-enforcement. Thus, even though the state of nature, everyone's free, everyone's equal, there's a big problem which Locke identifies. Now we're on chapter 9 of Locke's book here. He says, if man in the state of nature be so free, as has been said, if he be absolute lord of his own person and possessions, equal to the greatest, subject to nobody, why will he part with this freedom? Why will he give up his empire and subject himself to the dominion and control of any other power? To which it is obvious to answer, though in the state of nature he has such a right, yet the enjoyment of it is very uncertain. The enjoyment of the property he has in the state of nature is unsafe, unsecure, and this makes him willing to leave a condition which, however free, is full of fears and continual dangers. Does it really matter if you're free and equal, if you're hiding in your cave worried about whether someone's going to execute the law of nature on you? So the solution to Locke is government. He says, mankind, notwithstanding all the privileges of the state of nature, being but in an ill condition while they remain in it, are quickly driven into society. He goes on and he says that people take sanctuary under the established laws of government. They willingly give up every one his single power of punishing, to be exercised by such alone as shall be appointed to it amongst them. Okay, here's a very important concept here. For us to have government, we have to give up something. Okay, so in the state of nature, we're free and equal, but the state of nature is also unsafe and unsecure. We can't stay there. We look to government for help, but there's a trade-off involved. So one of Locke's key insights was that in a government by the people trade some of their liberty for more security. Okay, so basically, we know the state of nature is unsafe and unsecure. We don't like it. We're uncomfortable. We're scared. And so we trade our right to enforce natural law. So we are no longer able to enforce the state of nature by ourselves. We give that up and we give it up to the government. So the government is the designated entity for enforcing natural law. And we're bound to accept the will of the majority, even if we disagree. Okay, so it's possible that once you've come into society, once you've given up your right to exist in the state of nature, that laws will be passed that you disagree with, and if so, too bad. Okay, so that's part of the trade-off with government action. Nonetheless, this is the paradox. Your remaining freedoms are safer and more secure. So you're actually able, in an ideal world, to enjoy the freedoms that you have left because you are secure. You have that degree of security. So what I want you to take away from this is that government action is always a trade-off between our freedom and our security. Okay, you have to remember that. The founders knew this. They were very aware of this. This is a quote from Federalist Essay number 2 by John Jay. He says, "Nothing is more certain than the indispensable necessity of government." We have to have government. "And it's equally undeniable that whenever and however it is instituted, the people must cede or give up to it some of their natural rights in order to vest it with requisite power." So we have to give up some of our freedom to give the government the ability to enforce natural law. In this little diagram I have on the slide, you see a person exchanging a handful of grain. Okay, so this handful of grain represents our freedom. And we're doing this trade. The other person has a handful of apples. And we think this trade looks pretty good to us. We think about what a good apple tastes like, where it's nice and crisp, and you bite into it, and it's juicy, and it's just the right mixture of tang and sweetness. Okay, and you're thinking, wow, those apples look pretty good, and I'm totally willing to trade this handful of grain for those apples. But we've probably also had an experience with bad apples. You know, apples where you bite into them and they just don't have much flavor. Maybe they're mealy or mushy, you know, bruised up. God forbid there's, you know, a worm in the apple. Or maybe you're in some kind of dystopian fairy tale and it's a poison apple, right? You're Snow White biting into the poison apple. So you have to take stock, you know, is this government offer of security, is it worth the liberty that we're giving up? Let's explore this just a little bit here. Anyway, this exchange was called by Locke the social contract. Okay, the idea that we give up some of our freedom in exchange for the government's promise of security. So let's think about it. Let's make it a little more personal. When have you traded freedom for security, or vice versa? When have you traded security for freedom? And there's some obvious examples we can think of. For example, if you drive a car, right? There's all kind of rules that you have to follow when you drive a car. You can't just drive however you want, at whatever speed you want. Okay, we have traffic signs and speed limits And even if you think you're ready to drive and your parents think you're ready to drive, if you're only 13 or 14, you still can't drive. You have to go down and get a driver's license. Okay, all these rules about driving that interfere with our freedom, but in general, we think it's worthwhile because driving can be a dangerous activity, and we want some regulation to stay safe. Okay, that's a obvious example is the rules about driving. Any area of society that you look at is going to have rules. For example, the 9/11 terror attacks. Many of you probably can't remember those, but those of us who are old enough remember it well. It was a very scary time, and people were looking to the government for more security. So in the aftermath of 9/11, President George W. Bush actually did a reorganization of certain bureaucratic agencies. We had a new Department of Homeland Security. We had a Transportation Security Administration, and you've probably run across these entities if you're traveling by air. So the TSA agents will greet you at the entrance to the gates. You have to take off your shoes, take off your belts, go through the scanner. You can't bring liquids more than a certain amount, etc. So all of these are impingements on our freedom, and they're supposed to give us more security, and whether it actually provides more security is probably an open question. But all government action is like that. It's a trade-off where we trade some of our freedom in the hopes that we get a decent proportion of security. And we've seen movement the other direction as well. Maybe not in government, but probably in your life. So if you're a college student, maybe you've moved out from your parents' house for the first time. Maybe you're in the dorm or an apartment by yourself. Let's think about this a minute. Let's think about what is it like at your parents' house, right? So at your parents' house, you have all kinds of free things. You have free rent, you have free food. Maybe your mom, makes your favorite meals, free internet. Maybe your parents let you drive the family car. God forbid, maybe your mom even still does your laundry for you. Okay, so life at your parents' house is great. It's the ultimate in security. Why would anyone ever move out? And the answer is, even though your parents provide a high degree of security, that security comes with an infringement on your freedom, right? So if you go out the door, your mom's going to ask you, where are you going and who are you going with and when will you be back home? And if you're just chilling out, playing video games or watching Netflix, your parents are going to say, hey, have you done your chores? Have you finished your homework? Haven't you been playing video games long enough? Did you get enough sleep last night? So this is the role of parents. They provide security, but also they impinge upon your freedom. And eventually, to become a well-rounded, responsible individual, you have to leave your parents' house, give up that security, and embrace your freedom. Now, freedom also means the ability to make choices your parents would not agree with, right? So you live in your own apartment now. You can go out and party if you want to. You can sleep through your classes if you want to. But if you do those things, you may also suffer the consequences associated with your freedom. Okay, so that's a general example. We have situations where we trade security and freedom for each other all the time. So you think about working a job. Many of you may have part-time jobs to get through college. Okay, you go to a job, you can't wear what you want, you can't show up when you want, you can't do whatever you want when you're at work, right? Your freedom is severely infringed upon. However, you work this job because at the end of the day, you're making money, right? And let's say that you come home and there's your roommate. Your roommate is still in their pajamas. They've been having a good day. They could do whatever they want. But let's say your roommate is also flat broke and you have money from your job. Money actually gives you some of your freedom back. It's amazing. So the question is, okay, who really is more free? Who's better able to enjoy their freedom? Your roommate who's a bum, or you having worked diligently at your part-time job and now you have some money to go in and spend on things that you enjoy. Okay, so this is just an example. We make these choices. We give up our freedom for security, but we want to still enjoy the freedoms that we have left. It's a very delicate balance. Okay, so John Locke and other Enlightenment philosophers heavily influenced the American founders. The really cool thing was that the founders were almost in a state of nature, right? I said you don't get to experiment on governments, but in a sense, the founders actually did get to do that. They had thrown off the British rule during the War for Independence. And now they were in a situation where they had to come up with their own form of government. Okay, so they had to make the decisions about what kinds of freedoms they would give up and what kind of security they would look for from the government. It was a very unique opportunity. And if you take a look at the Declaration of Independence, you can see that the foundation for this new government was heavily influenced by Locke. Okay, so the Declaration of Independence asserts that people are inherently free and equal. It says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So you can actually read the Declaration of Independence if you have the Accessible Federalist by Professor Seagrave, which hopefully you all have by now. That's on page 83 of the Accessible Federalist. The Declaration of Independence also asserts that good government comes by the consent of the governed, that people voluntarily give up their freedoms for the security that government provides. So again, heavy influence by Locke and his social contract. Okay, here's the first problem that we encounter. So we know that freedom and equality are kind of core American values, but they're somewhat squishy and hard to define. The question is, how do you define freedom? And James Madison was actually worried about defining his terms. So I'm an attorney, and when I write up an agreement or a contract for some of my clients, I have to be very careful how I define my terms, because in the future, if there's some kind of dispute or argument, the other side may get an attorney and try and twist the agreement against my client, right? So this is why attorneys write very long contracts trying to capture all the nuances of their terms. So here's James Madison, Federalist Essay 37. This is on page 22 of the Accessible Federalist. And he says, besides the difficulties arising from the complexity of objects and the imperfection of our human powers of perception, the vehicle for communicating our ideas to one another adds another dimension of difficulty. The use of words is to express ideas. Clarity of expression, therefore, requires not only that the ideas be clearly formed, but also that they be expressed by words specifically and exclusively paired with them. But, he says, no language can supply words and phrases for every complex idea, and every language includes many words that contain multiple meanings. So Madison says clarity of expression requires the careful definition of terms. That's how Professor Seagrave translated that section of Federalist 37. The original Federalist says perspicuity. Okay, perspicuity is a great old-fashioned word for clarity of expression. So clarity of expression or perspicuity requires that terms be carefully defined. But here we have this word freedom, this word liberty, very, very important. And it has many different meanings. In fact, there's another Enlightenment philosopher we'll talk about next time named Montesquieu. And Montesquieu says there's no word that admits of more various significations, no word that has more different shades of meaning than the word liberty. So here's our meme for the day. You keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means. Okay, this is a reference to The Princess Bride. So if you have not watched the movie Princess Bride, I encourage you to do so, especially if you're in coronavirus shutdown. Great thing is to watch some classic movies like The Princess Bride, and then you'll get the meaning of some of the memes I'm going to be using today. Okay, so we have to be careful how we define our terms. And even though freedom and equality are core American values, there are different definitions for these two very important terms. Let's talk about freedom first. Okay, there's two kinds of freedom. They're called negative freedom and positive freedom. Now, negative and positive, this is not a moral judgment. Okay, negative freedom is not automatically worse than positive freedom or anything like that. We'll discuss this. So negative freedom is called negative because it requires government absence. It's also called freedom from government interference. Basically, when you have negative freedom, what you're doing is you're telling the government to leave you alone. Negative freedom is government, leave me alone freedom. On the other side, you have something called positive freedom. Positive freedom requires government aid. It's also known as freedom to, for example, freedom to free healthcare. So the idea behind positive freedom is that, let's say you're very poor and you can't afford the things that you need and want. Let's say that you don't have good housing, you don't have good health care, your wages are very low. And so positive freedom asks the question, are you really free? Can you really reach your potential? Can you really do the things that you want to do if your life is lacking in that way? And why don't you let the government come help you so that you can be more free? Okay, so positive freedom in a nutshell just is government help me freedom. Now this is very interesting. Two kinds of freedom. One kind where you're saying government leave me alone, and the other kind where you're saying government help me. They're almost opposites from each other. It's an interesting question. You know, what do you want? Do you want the government to leave you alone, or what do you want the government to help you? I have an example that maybe will help us flesh this out a little bit. You'll see next to the positive freedom, I have an icon, person with a fistful of money. Okay, so positive freedom generally costs money. Okay, in general, doesn't really cost the government anything to leave you alone. But if the government's going to help you, they need funding, money to help you, and they get that money by taxes. Okay, so let's talk this through. Let's say that you are founding a brand new government, and the thing that you love more than anything else in the whole world is chocolate milk. Okay, and so in this new society that you're founding, you want freedom of chocolate milk. Okay, that's in your Bill of Rights, freedom of chocolate milk. Let's think about what that might mean if your Bill of Rights is a charter of negative freedoms. Okay, if you're talking about negative freedom and you want freedom of chocolate milk, what you're saying is you're saying that the government must leave you alone in your imbibing of chocolate milk, that they can't fat shame you for drinking something that has so much sugar and carbs in it, that they can't regulate you, that you should be able to drink it whenever and however you want, even if you want to drink it right out of the carton. Nobody can stop you, especially not the government. Okay, so that would be negative freedom of chocolate milk right there. The flip side, let's say that you believed in positive freedom of chocolate milk. That would mean that you think chocolate milk is so important that every man, woman, and child is entitled to have chocolate milk for free, that the government must provide the chocolate milk. Okay, we know the chocolate milk farmers, okay, they're not going to voluntarily provide chocolate milk for free. So the government is going to raise taxes and use those tax money to buy chocolate milk and distribute the allotment to every family as appropriate. Okay, and you think that chocolate milk is so important that you want to do that. So I hope you can see the difference. First scenario, negative freedom, government has to leave you alone in how you drink your chocolate milk, but you have to decide how much you want and how you're going to pay for it. On the other hand, government gives you chocolate milk. It helps you have access to chocolate milk, but you do lose some of your freedom, most significantly your freedom in the form of taxes that you have to pay for this chocolate milk allotment. And so you can argue back and forth about which one is a better policy, but I think this illustration helps you understand the difference between negative freedom, government leave me alone freedom, and positive freedom, government help me freedom. Let's talk about equality. Similarly, you have equality before the law. That just means the government treats everyone the same under the law. The government is blind, doesn't care what you look like, what group you might be in, and the law treats everyone the same. Now, there's something else called equality of opportunity. Okay, this means that the government recognizes that certain groups may not have a natural level playing field. Certain groups may be disadvantaged historically, and so what the government does in that case is that instead of being blind, it actually peeks out between its fingers a little bit and sees whether or not you're part of a disadvantaged group, and if you are, then the government has a law for your protection and your help. Okay, so equality before the law means the government is blind to your particular group identity. Equality of opportunity means that individuals who belong to certain underprivileged or disadvantaged groups get assistance from the government to be more equal. All right. Can you tell which views were held by the founders? Okay, I'm going to give you a little spoiler alert here. The founders were all about the negative freedom. They were all about the government, leave me alone freedom. But over time, and we'll talk about this, we'll do our little tour through American history. Over time, we've definitely been moving more toward a positive conception of freedom, more toward a government help me kind of freedom. So we'll talk about how exactly that happened. But for purposes of this lecture, you should know that the founders were all about the negative freedom. Let's talk about the founders' first attempt at a national government. This took place during the Revolutionary War, actually, in 1777. We can call this are National Government 1.0, the beta version, the Articles of Confederation. The first thing that you need to know is that at the time, the states really did not consider themselves as one united country. They really saw themselves as separate and independent and sovereign nation states. So basically, this Articles of Confederation was more like a treaty between the various states, the states that had previously all been British colonies. The Articles were a league of friendship. That comes directly from the Articles of Confederation. If you take a look at your Accessible Federalist at page 87, we actually have a copy of the Articles of Confederation. And Article 2 states that each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence. And then Article 3 goes on to say the said states hereby severally enter into a firm league of friendship with each other for their common defense, the security of their liberties, and their mutual and general welfare. So it was a treaty, a league of friendship between the 13 original states. There was a Congress, but there was no president and no Supreme Court. And each state was responsible for contributing taxes and troops upon request. So the United States was in the middle of a war for its very survival, and wars are quite expensive. They require funds and they require manpower. And so the Congress would meet under the Articles of Confederation. They would agree that the states would contribute so much money and so much manpower, but the national government had no power to enforce its requests. The national government had no direct control over the people. It had to govern through the states, and unfortunately, the national government was not getting everything that it had been promised. Take a look at Federalist Essay 15. This is reproduced in the Accessible Federalist starting page 13. This is Hamilton talking about the Articles of Confederation. I enjoy how Hamilton starts out this essay. He says, "If the journey through these pages seems boring or bothersome at times," and I hope that it does not seem so to you, but Hamilton at least acknowledged that possibility. He said that you should remember three things. Number one, that you are in search of information on the most important subject which can concern free people, and so on and so forth. So basically he says, I know that this may seem tedious at times, but this stuff is really important, okay? This is the most important subject which can concern free people, and that is the subject of what form should our government take. Hamilton goes on, he says the next planned topic, because remember each essay was topical, 85 essays in the Federalist Papers, and the topic of Federalist 15 is, quote unquote, the insufficiency of the existing Confederation to the preservation of the Union. He was going to talk about why the Articles of Confederation were not good enough. He goes on, he says, why, though, should we take the trouble to argue a point which everyone, opponents and friends of the new Constitution alike, seems to admit already? So he says, look, everybody knows Articles of Confederation are not doing the job. Hamilton goes on, something must be done to remedy the significant imperfections in our national system and rescue us from impending anarchy. He goes on, this is the second paragraph on page 14. We have indeed reached almost the last stage of national humiliation. We have experienced nearly everything that can injure the pride or degrade the standing of an independent nation. We violated our obligations to other nations. We've been unable to repay the debts to foreigners and to our own citizens. we have allowed valuable territories and important posts to continue in the possession of a foreign power, etc. And he says this has occurred because we have neither the troops nor the treasury nor the government to enable us to repel the aggression. They weren't getting the money, they weren't getting the manpower, and Hamilton felt they didn't even have the government organization to repel foreign powers on the North American continent. He goes on, he says, we've nevertheless fallen prey to every conceivable national disorder, poverty, and insignificance. So he's really waxing quite eloquently about the trouble the United States was in, the trouble that this new country was in because the Articles of Confederation were too weak. He says the United States has the power to raise troops and money from the states in theory, but it has no authority. He says the government cannot reach the actual people of the country. It can only govern through the states. And he says, although in theory the resolutions of the United States concerning these matters are laws, constitutionally obligating the member states, in practice they are mere recommendations, which the states follow or ignore at their discretion. So he says that the states are treating the resolutions of the Congress under the Articles of Confederation like suggestions or recommendations, and they don't really have to do it. He goes on, he makes this interesting statement. Why has government been established at all? We asked this question when we talked about what's the point of government. Because the passions of men will not be led by reason and justice unless they are constrained to do so by some external force. So he says you have to have rules and you have to have a force to make people obey the rules. Looking to the end of the essay, he's talking about, we're on page 18 of the Accessible Federalist, and he says, the measures of the Union under the Articles of Confederation have not been carried out. The failures of the states to comply have become so extreme as to bring the wheels of the national government to a grinding halt. Each state giving in to the powerful voice of immediate interest or convenience has one by one withdrawn its support of the Union. So when one state doesn't fulfill its obligations, then the other states say, hey, why is that state getting away with not fulfilling its obligations? And they withdraw their support. And Hamilton winds up his essay, the frail and tottering building now seems ready to fall upon our heads and crush us beneath its ruins. So basically Hamilton's saying the sky is falling. The situation is quite dire. Articles of Confederation are not doing the job, and we need to take immediate action. That's Hamilton in Federalist Essay 15. So let's review a little bit. Basically, under the Articles of Confederation, the national government was just not strong enough to fend off foreign powers. The United States made it through the Revolutionary War, but Great Britain still had troops in the Midwest and Canada. So Great Britain was still right there looking at the United States, licking its chops. You also had Spain. Spain claimed Florida, California, and the Mississippi River Valley. In addition, you had the problem of pirates. American merchant ships were actually being attacked by Barbary pirates off the coast of Africa. When the United States said they didn't want to be a part of Great Britain anymore, there was a problem because the United States didn't really have its own navy. The British Navy was excellent, but now the United States was on its own, and this meant that American merchant ships were vulnerable to attack. This is from the textbook, Understanding American Government, page 38. I'm reading here, and you do not have to buy the textbook for this course, by the way. I'm just reading this little excerpt here on the Black Flag on the high seas. As many as 100 merchant ships sailed from American ports to Mediterranean cities each year, bringing salted fish, flour, sugar, and lumber, and returning with figs, lemons, oranges, olive oil, and opium. Barbary pirates from North Africa preyed upon these ships in the Mediterranean Sea, seizing sailors, holding them for ransom, or pressing them into slavery and extorting money from shippers and governments. Historians estimate that 1 million Europeans and Americans were kidnapped or enslaved by these pirates in the 17th and 18th centuries. We're going to talk about slavery a little later, but it was quite interesting. Obviously, the American colonies had African slaves working in the plantations. Here we have the reverse situation. We had Europeans, white Americans and Europeans, being captured and sold into slavery by African pirates. Some of these white slaves actually smuggled out letters back home to their loved ones, and these were very important in fueling the abolitionist movement, because it was a description of what slavery was like from the inside view. Obviously, it's a horrible institution, and so you had many voices calling for the abolition of slavery, including the sailors and the merchants that had been kidnapped and pressed into slavery themselves. So we'll talk more about slavery, but for the moment, Barbary pirates were just one more problem that the new government was not equipped to deal with. And the question was, had America valued its freedom at the expense of its security? The government was not strong enough to provide the security that the new country needed. Thomas Jefferson made this comment, there never will be money in the Treasury until the Confederacy, meaning the government under the Articles of Confederation, shows its teeth. The states must see the rod. In other words, somebody had to spank those states and get them into order because the whole thing was just falling apart. Foreign encroachment was not the only problem. Okay, under the Articles of Confederation, the national government was also threatened by domestic unrest. So many states had financial difficulties paying off war debts, and it kind of devolved into this class warfare where you had poor farmers that were being taxed, that were being pressed to pay their debts, and they just couldn't afford it. So poor farmers were especially desperate for relief from debt and high taxes. Basically, this is one example of a kind of rebellion by these farmers. There was a Revolutionary War hero, Captain Daniel Shays, and he led an attack on a federal court and a federal armory in Springfield, Massachusetts. It was more like a mob, but it was very scary. It was in all the newspapers at the time. It was called Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion was put down, but there were casualties. Daniel Shays and his farmer friends were able to shut down the courts, and 4 people were killed and 20 people were wounded. And this was just horrifying to the American people who were not used to this level of violence at home. Okay, so it was obvious something had to be done. The founders believed that a radical change was necessary. We had to come up with a new constitution. We have to move away from the Articles of Confederation and toward a more energetic government. If you can see the slide, you'll see a second meme from The Princess Bride. The Articles of Confederation represented humiliations galore. Okay, if Hamilton had been living today, he would have used that expression, humiliations galore. It was just really embarrassing. And so the bottom line was that the founders wanted to give the United States the government that it needed to do the job. I'm going to read to you guys again. This is from the original Federalist Papers. Pull this up here. Hamilton says, the absurdity must continually stare us in the face of confiding to a government the direction of the most essential national interests without daring to trust it to the authorities which are indispensable to their proper and efficient management. So he says we're asking the government to do these very important things, but we're not giving it the authority to do that. He goes on. He says, I'll pull this up here, whether there ought to be a federal government. This is from Federalist Essay 23. He says whether there ought to be a federal government, whether there should be a national government, entrusted with the care of the common defense is a question in the first instant open to discussion. He says we can talk about whether you really want to have a national government as opposed to 13 separate state governments. But the moment it is decided in the affirmative, the moment you decide, yes, I want a national government, it will follow that the government ought to be clothed with all the powers requisite to complete execution of its trust. So we entrust the government to act, so we need to give it the power to do so. The Union ought to be invested with full power to levy troops, build and equip fleets, and raise the revenues required for the formation and support of an army and navy in the customary and ordinary modes practiced in other governments. So Hamilton's saying we need to have a modern system of government. Now, the new Constitution was somewhat controversial. Some people still argued that the trade-off in liberty was too high. Okay, so we're going to talk about that. Remember, you have to give up some of your freedom every time you ask the government to provide additional security. Here are the founders. They're saying we need a stronger government. It's not secure enough. But there are dissenters who say the trade-off in liberty is too high. We'll come back and talk about them. The dissenters were called the anti-federalists. So remember, the federalists were the ones that wrote the Federalist Papers that were defending the new Constitution, and their opponents were called the anti-federalists. We'll come back to them. Okay, so here we are, 1787, 11 years after the Declaration of Independence. The Articles of Confederation, for the most part, has been not very successful. So the founders held a constitutional convention in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The goal of the convention, they at first thought maybe they would rewrite the Articles of Confederation. Actually, they ended up totally replacing them. Okay, so that's what happened. They had a convention. They sat in a big conference room without air conditioning. It was very warm that summer, the summer of 1787, and they had to come up with a new form of government. James Madison, this is his picture here, he was considered to be the father of the Constitution. He was one of the delegates from Virginia. He was a little guy. Okay, so he was not much taller than 5 foot. He weighed maybe 100 pounds. Later he became president. He was our smallest president, but he used his mind to overcome those obstacles. He's what my kids would call a try-hard. Okay, so he was very interested in constitutions, and he studied up for this constitutional convention. He reviewed all of the systems of government and constitutional documents available in Europe. He looked very carefully at all of the different constitutions of the 13 states, because each of the state governments by that time had its own constitution, and he tried to figure out what were the best elements of those. And he actually arrived in Virginia with a draft. He got there 2 weeks early just to prepare, and his Virginia Plan was the first draft of the Constitution. Now, we did not end up ultimately adopting the Virginia Plan. There were a lot of compromises and changes that we'll talk about last time. But still, the contributions of James Madison, very, very important. Here's another little Princess Bride reference. Madison was a small man with a dizzying intellect. So if you watch The Princess Bride, look for that reference. Someone who's small, but very, very smart. That was James Madison. Okay, it took 4 months of negotiations. So they had a lot to hash out. Again, they didn't just let Madison do all the work and then rubber stamp his Virginia Plan. They had a lot to argue about, which we'll talk about. It took 4 months. The new Constitution was ready, but it was not yet ratified. Okay, this is very important. Just because a bunch of influential people got in a room, came up with a form of government, it did not automatically become effective. They could not just impose it on the American people. They had to allow the American people to ratify, to adopt the Constitution voluntarily. They had to make their case. Again, there were people who were opposed to the new Constitution. This included anti-federalists like famous patriot Patrick Henry. Okay, Patrick Henry argued the trade-off in liberty was just too high. Again, I'm going to read you from the original documents because I think that's important. I'm going to read to you from the Anti-Federalist Papers. And now the Federalist won. Obviously, we did get this new Constitution, so the Federalist Papers are considered more important than the Anti-Federalist Papers. But I think this will be interesting for you just to hear Patrick Henry's speech. I'm just going to read excerpts. It's multiple pages long, okay? He was a big speaker. This was the speech of Patrick Henry before the Virginia Ratifying Convention in June 1788. He says, "Don't inquire how your trade may be increased, nor how you are to become a great and powerful people, but how your liberty can be secured. Liberty ought to be the direct end of your government." Okay, Patrick Henry was the one who said, "Give me liberty or give me death," right? His famous quote. So you know that he'll be very concerned about freedom, very concerned about how much freedom this new government could potentially take away from the people. He goes on, he says, "Guard with jealous attention the public liberty. Suspect everyone who approaches that jewel." So I had the little clip art picture for you guys showing the person with a handful of grain that's trying to exchange that for the handful of apples, and freedom was represented by the handful of grain. Patrick Henry would have said, no. It's not a handful of grain. It's a handful of diamonds, okay? They're precious jewels, your liberty, and you should be very suspicious of anyone who tries to approach it and get you to give it away. He says, quit dogging on the Articles of Confederation. Didn't this despised government win the Revolutionary War? He says, this Confederation, this same despised government, merits, in my opinion, the highest praise. It carried us through a long and dangerous war. It rendered us victorious in that bloody conflict with a powerful nation, with England. It secured us a territory greater than any European monarch possesses. And shall a government which has been thus strong and vigorous be accused of imbecility and abandoned for want of energy? So he says, look, we won the Revolutionary War. What else do you need a government for? And our territory is bigger than the territory of any of the kingdoms of Europe. Don't be so fast to claim that the Articles of Confederation are humiliations galore. Henry goes on, he says, those nations who have gone in search of grandeur, power, and splendor have also fallen a sacrifice and been the victim of their own folly. While they acquired those visionary blessings, they lost their freedom. So he says there's always a trade-off involved. If you want to be big and mighty and have this, that, and the other thing, you're going to have to trade your freedom for that. He says, shall we imitate the example of those nations who have gone from a simple to a splendid government? Are those nations more worthy of our imitation? What can make an adequate satisfaction to them for the loss they suffered in attaining such a government, the loss of their liberty? If we admit this consolidated government, so Henry said if we're going to do this stronger national government thing, it will be because we like a great, splendid one. Some way or other, we must be a great and mighty nation. We must have an army and a navy and a number of things. But back in the good old days, says Patrick Henry, when the American spirit was in its youth, the language of America was different. Liberty was the primary object. So we hear Patrick Henry saying, basically, who cares if a nation is great and splendid and powerful? I only want my freedom. He accuses Hamilton of scare tactics. And you remember, Hamilton did kind of go for the rhetoric there. He's talking about the edifice, the building falling upon our heads. And Patrick Henry says, why tell us of dangers to terrify us into an adoption of this new government? Basically, quit your scare tactics. Henry goes on and on, page after page. No matter whether a people be great, splendid, and powerful, if they only enjoy freedom. Finally, he's winding down here. He says, in forming a government, the utmost care should be taken to prevent its becoming oppressive. And in defense of the Federalists, they were also concerned that the government did not become oppressive. Okay, nobody wanted an oppressive government. Patrick Henry says, this government is of such an intricate and complicated nature that no man on this earth can know its real operation. The new Constitution is too intricate and complicated. Who knows how it's going to work? That was kind of a valid point that Henry had. We'll see this Constitution is pretty complicated. It's a lot more complicated than the constitutions of Europe. And it did sometimes work in ways the founders did not intend. Today, we take a strong national government for granted. So what was Henry so worried about? You know, again, Henry was a patriot. He fought in the Revolutionary War. They fought for freedom. They fought to overthrow the British rule. So really, there would be no point in throwing off the British government if they were just going to reconstruct a new government that was similarly big and oppressive. Okay, that's what Patrick Henry was worried about. You know, the Federalists had to make their case. They had to argue that the Constitution was a good thing to the American people, and that's where we get the Federalist Papers. We talked about this in the introductory lecture on Syllabus Day. Federalist Papers are a series of New York newspaper articles written 1787 to 1788. That's why Professor Seagrave felt the need to translate the Federalist Papers. They are in English, but thankfully we have the accessible Federalist now. They kind of broke it down into more modern English. They were written by John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison. Hopefully you recognize Madison's name, founder or the father of the Constitution, excuse me. They wrote under the pen name of Publius. Publius was a Roman general that was one of the founders of the Roman Republic, very influential, and so the Federalists saw themselves as founding a new republic, and they wanted to take the best features of prior governments, including the Roman Republic. The Federalist Papers is considered the most important work in U.S. political science. Okay, these 85 newspaper essays, very, very important. Okay, let's talk about ratification. Article 7 of the Constitution set up the terms for ratification. The Constitution could not become law until it was adopted by conventions in at least 9 states. Okay, so this was something that happened on a state-by-state basis. Congress could not ratify. The states had to ratify one by one. And the ratification process took some time. It lasted from 1787 to 1790. And you can see here on this map, the yellow represents Federalist areas. The pink represents anti-Federalist areas. There were also some areas that were evenly divided. You can see the Federalists had their work cut out for them. There's a lot of pink on that map. One by one, the states adopted the new Constitution. The last holdout was Rhode Island. Okay, little bitty Rhode Island. Now, under Article 7 of the new Constitution, once 9 states ratified, it was in effect. So by 1790, we had a new Constitution. We had the United States. And basically, the United States told Rhode Island, do you really want to be a teeny tiny foreign government surrounded by the United States? Is that really, how we're going down here? You want us to treat you like a foreign country surrounded by a much more powerful country? And Rhode Island thought about it, and they decided to ratify also. So finally, all 13 states had ratified. But the anti-federalists had to be appeased. They wanted additional protections for their personal freedom before they would ratify. Okay, so they said, look, we will ratify the new Constitution, but we want written assurances that our personal freedoms will be protected. And that actually is the Bill of Rights. Okay, so the Bill of Rights is the legacy of the anti-federalists. The Bill of Rights, that's freedom of speech, freedom of religion, right to bear arms, etc. That was not part of the original Constitution. We'll talk about why the Bill of Rights was not originally included in the Constitution, but at any rate, this is the legacy of the anti-federalists. They said, we'll ratify the Constitution, but we need to also immediately ratify the Bill of Rights, and that's exactly what happened. Okay, please prepare for the next lecture by reading Federalist Essay 47. That can be found in the Accessible Federalist, pages 29 to 35. If you have any questions, please email me. Good luck, and we'll see you next time.